It's time to get into the next step. This is really the roll your sleeves up part. We've talked about the affordability framework, and now we're talking about how do you make that happen? How do you actually finance affordable housing projects? There's many different ways to do that, as you heard, and this panel is going to dig a little deeper into it, and there will be time to ask questions during their presentation. So I'm going to hand it over now to Nick, and the panel can introduce themselves and get going. Thanks, Nick.
All right, thank you, everyone. Nick Popenook with Tiberius Solutions. We are a government finance consulting firm providing local governments and their private and nonprofit development partners with financial advising. We're here today to talk about financing affordable housing solutions, and we have a terrific panel, these three experts up here that all have a different lens to help provide expertise and guidance on how these projects come together. And we heard this morning from Director Bell that money isn't everything. A project still needs to have accountability. You need to have vision. You need to have dedication and resolve. You need to have coordination, a whole lot of requirements in order to deliver affordable housing projects. But money is still a very critical piece of that overall package. And so we are excited to be able to share some stories and some guidance on how these projects can come together and how these dollars can be brought in to make these projects a reality. Our three panelists here today include Andrea Sanchez, the Deputy Director of the Housing Development Center. We have Warren Sebra from Novogradic, and Elaine Howard from Elaine Howard Consulting. So each of them have a PowerPoint presentation that we're going to share, but we do want this to be a true panelist discussion, not an hour-long academic lecture. So at any point along the way, we encourage folks to raise their hand, let us know if you have a question for any of these speakers, and we'd like to be able to answer those questions throughout the presentation rather than making you listen to an hour-long presentation on the details and the number crunching involved in financing affordable housing. So with that, let's go ahead and turn things over to our first speaker, Andrea, to provide an overview of the process and sort of the roles that are involved in developing affordable housing. Thank you. Andrea?
Thank you. It's nice to see some friends out in the audience. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. And I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the process and roles involved in development before we get into how to finance it. So there are, and I'm going to also try to operate while speaking here. So I'm going to start about the phases of development, and there's really 4 distinct phases. And the first is the feasibility phase. The second is pre-development. The third is construction, and then the last is closeout. And then you move into operating the affordable housing, and my presentation is really focused on the development, but that is not to negate the importance of operations, and that's really when asset management and property management are the key players. The development process can take a long time. I would say on average 3 to 5 years. So it is not something that happens quickly, in particular when we're working with layered, complicated financing sources. Let's see, the next slide. So in order to realize affordable housing, it takes an incredible amount of team members. It literally is not just your architect and your general contractor and your organization's staff, but it's attorneys, it's engineers, it's surveyors. And so really the work becomes about project managing this entire team of people. There is the core team, though, which is made up of the architect and the GC, and maybe you'd have a development consultant on board or a construction manager, as well as your funders and lenders. That's really who your core team is. In terms of procuring that team of all of the team, but in particular the core team, procurement can be tricky depending on if it's a public agency or not, but it is the basis of a successful development is on that relationship that those parties hold. And so getting architects who are familiar with affordable housing and understanding the compliance pieces, getting general contractors on board as well that understand maybe MWESB requirements. So really being in that selection process, making sure that you're selecting core team members with experience with affordable housing, because it is different than private for-profit multifamily development. So a little bit about the owner's role in the development process. And this assumes that your organization has made a strategic decision that we're ready to be developers, we're ready to be owners and operators. It assumes that you have the required balance sheet to borrow sufficient funds and to act as a guarantor. And that you have the appropriate staffing infrastructure to own and operate affordable housing, or that you have a plan to hire those people third party. So during the development process, in particular during those early stages of development, the role of the owner is to identify a vision, to understand with this vision about how much money is it going to cost for me to operate this project realistically. Are we going to serve a special needs population? Do we have service providers on board to serve those populations? Do we have sufficient service funding available to serve those populations? And do we need rent assistance to serve those populations? So it's this very strategic, visionary part of the development process. And procure your funding. And when all those pieces come together, and we hit this major milestone, which we refer to as construction loan close, construction begins. On average, I would say it takes about a year to construct a project, but we are seeing more and more that we're moving from 50 to 60 unit projects, which are funded with 9% low-income housing tax credits, to larger projects that are up to 150 units. And those projects can take up to a year and a half to construct. And then the last phase is lease up and close out. So the owner's role in lease up is to get those units leased up, work with your property manager, work with asset management, work with your service providers, and begin understanding how you're going to monitor for your regulatory compliance. And the fun part, the risks. So development is not for the faint of heart. It is a risky, it's risky is what it is. And the risk shifts throughout the development process. So in the feasibility and in the pre-development phase, in particular in the feasibility, when you're looking for a site and you maybe need to do due diligence on a site, like you want to do some environmental analysis of the land, you want to understand, you pull a title report and you want to understand, are there easements on this property? All of that is at the organization's risk. And so you may decide not to buy that piece of land, but have spent $50,000 to $100,000 doing those studies to help you make that decision. And 100% of that is on the organization to pay for. And if you decide to not go forward, those are sunk costs. During pre-development, the risk reduces just a little bit. This is when you are trying to obtain your funding. You're having to pay an architect at this point to do drawings for submittal to funding applications. with the hope that your project will get funded and your organization will then be reimbursed at construction loan close. If for some reason the project doesn't move forward, if it doesn't get funded in the first time around and you have to apply a second time around, those are all going to be costs that the organization has expended, and you may not get reimbursed. It could be several years until the organization is reimbursed for those expenses. And then in construction, the risk is really about finishing the project. Your organization will be acting as the construction loan guarantor. So it is a very risky time, but it's more manageable. It's about managing the GC, managing costs. It's less about those sunk costs. Right now, though, in the market, we're seeing interest rates higher than we ever could have predicted, and so that's an example of a risk that no project management can solve that problem. And projects are having to pay more in construction interest than we ever imagined, and that impacts a whole lot of things, but I won't go into those details, but it's a risk. And then the risk in lease up and closeout is really leasing up on time. So there's a schedule which we agree to, and it's super important that property management is on board and understands that schedule and is leasing up those units. So the board and management plays another important role. Your boards need to buy on to strategically, we want to be a developer, we want to own and operate affordable housing. Fiduciary-wise, they need to be able to understand that the balance sheet is at risk, that there's sufficient liquidity, and that you're going to be using that liquidity in order to realize this development. And then strategically, and I would say visionary, it gets back again to who are you trying to serve with the development. So one of my co-presenters is really going to get into the financing aspect, but this slide is just really meant to demonstrate the funding challenge with affordable housing. So this is based on comparable projects in the office, but it's not a particular project. But you can see that the far left-hand column is the amount. Well, I should start with saying that the costs, whether or not it's a 30% unit, a 50% MFI serving unit, or a 60% MFI serving unit, the cost to build it remains the same. So your uses remain the same. And this is using a 3-bedroom unit as an example. But your sources to build that unit are going to decrease depending upon a decrease as you decrease the population that you're trying to serve. So a 30% MFI population, what I'm demonstrating here is that the rent that you would collect from those tenants, for this particular unit, it would not support any private debt. For a 50% unit, it does support debt, but not as much as a 60% unit. And so that financing gap is what you're trying to solve for. And that's when we go ask our public local funders for funds, when we go to OHCS and ask for tax credits. That's the gap you're trying to fill. And so if anyone is interested, this analysis is based on 2022 HUD published rents. And I assumed $7,000 per unit per year of annual operating costs, which is kind of in the middle. You know, there are populations where that number would be higher. And the higher the operating costs, the lower the amount of private debt that the project can support. So ownership roles, and Warren's definitely going to go more in depth in this. This is just a high level graphic to show that when we have a LIHTC project, the sponsor or developer is the general partner, and your investor, the purchaser of your tax credits, is the limited partnership. You join together to form a limited partnership, and you are in partnership for 15 years with the investor, with the limited partner and the general partner. And this is just really, this next slide goes a little bit into timelines as well. It's also demonstrating the ownership structure. So initially out of the gate, your organization owns the land throughout the pre-development period. You own the land, you have the contracts with the architect and the GC, and then when construction starts and we hit this milestone of construction loan close, everything is transferred into the limited partnership. And that is for the 15-year period that I mentioned. And then after 15 years, the sponsor owns 100%, and you enter into what's called an extended affordability period. And then I'm just gonna close out with the importance of developing is one thing, and there's a lot of risk there, but owning and operating affordable housing and serving the people that we intend to serve, the whole reason that we are in this business, is in some ways even more important than the development process itself. You must have the right infrastructure in place, the services to serve the people that you intend to serve, and it requires the right staffing infrastructure. So there's a lot of strategic decision-making that needs to happen up front as you explore this idea of development and understanding how that's going to be funded for your organization, and if you're able to hire people or if you're going to have third-party consultants do that. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Nick.
I think this would be a great time if folks had any questions specifically on Andrea's presentation. And one question I'd like to actually start with is, Andrea, could you tell us a little bit more about your own organization? We kind of skipped over any formal introductions, and so let us know, sort of your role in the process here.
Yeah. Can you all hear me? Okay. So the Housing Development Center has been around for about 30 years. We're located in Portland, Oregon, but we serve across the entire state of Oregon. And our three main business lines are development consulting services, asset management, and then we also have a community development funding institution. So we lend during the pre-development period, and we have a higher tolerance for risk, and we typically lend out to our clients. We have a staff of nearly 25 that's made up of finance project managers, so more folks that have the brain like me. And then we also have a staff made up of construction project managers that are involved in all phases of development, but many of them are trained architects. And they are our client's primary contact during the construction period. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that I had, one of your slides earlier on showed the list of all the roles of folks that need to be involved to make these projects a success, including architects and attorneys and surveyors and the whole list of folks. There might be folks in this room who have those skills but haven't been directly involved in an affordable housing project before, or maybe the folks in this room know others that they think would be great and have those skills and could be involved in these projects but don't have that direct experience. Do you have any thoughts on sort of where should they turn to first? If folks know they can get involved in this project, but there's so many people that need to be involved, how does a project sort of initially come together? Where's a good first stop for people to turn to?
That's a great question. So I'll go back to the example of if there's a piece of land or maybe even an existing project, like a multifamily existing development that you're interested in purchasing. The first stop would be to make that go, no-go decision would be to go to your local title company and pull a title report, hire someone who could do a phase 1 study, and then doing that initial financial feasibility might even, this is one where some people think that understanding the land is more important than understanding the financing. I'm going to say both are important, but understanding if you want to serve X population and you want to apply for 9% low-income housing tax credits, at least understanding conceptually if your project is financially feasible before you spend a lot of money would be my go-to.
Thank you. All right, do we have any other questions right now for Andrea before we bring on our next presenter? Any hands? All right, we'll have time for questions at the end of this as well. So our next presenter is Warren Sebra from Novogradac, and he's going to come up here and tell us a little bit more about the details of using LIHTC to finance these projects. So coming up, Warren.
Thank you, Nick. Glad to be here with individuals who support and are developing affordable housing. It's something that has been a passion of mine since I started my professional career. I've been working with affordable housing for 20 years as a CPA. And you're like, what does the CPA have to do with affordable housing? Well, you know, CPAs are used for many different things, but part of our role as a CPA firm that does work in affordable housing is we help with some consulting, some finance consulting, projections, forecasting at the feasibility end, and also once the project's built and developed, you need a CPA to do your audit and tax and your final cost certifications, and that's where we come along to help serve our clients who are affordable housing developers and do that. So that's why I've been involved in here for like I said 20 years doing affordable housing, helping my clients develop good affordable housing. So awesome, came up. So this is kind of a little flow chart, and don't get too crazy, but I think I try not to get too complex, because as anyone who's done an affordable housing project knows, no two deals are alike, and the financing can be incredibly complex. And so I was just trying to show the flow of the funds a little bit here, and focus on the sources, right? The uses, we could figure those out, talk about those, but focus on the sources of funds. And there's kind of three, as Andrea kind of mentioned, there's kind of three entities here to kind of think about. You have your developer general partner, and oftentimes that developer general partner might have two separate entities, one who is a developer, one maybe is also general partner. And you have your operating partnership, where it owns and operates the project and leases out the units to tenants who qualify for affordable housing. Then you have the investor fund, and this oftentimes is a syndicated fund by national syndicators, and behind that fund you'll have investors. And oftentimes, when you're an affordable housing developer, you only see the fund. You don't see the end investors. You deal with the fund syndicators, the big banks of the world. You've heard them. They're all kind of some of the funds. There are some investors who direct invest, but mainly it's funds that have investors which you don't see. So what happens here in this particular structure, I call it the tiered LIHTC structure, 4% bonds, right? Those who are familiar, there's two types of flavors of LIHTC projects or low-income housing tax credit projects, 4%, 9%. 9% is you apply to receive an award of tax credits. 4% you apply to receive an award of tax-exempt bonds from the bond volume cap. And if you receive that from the bond volume cap, as long as you meet a few certain things, you can claim credits. And here, you have with 4% generates less credits than 9%. So 9% is your credits are calculated based upon your project cost or your eligible project cost, which is called eligible basis. And since you have a 4% credit, you're going to get less equity. And so in 4%, you're going to have a larger gap. And so you look down here about the sources, you have, limited partner equity, about $7 million. GP equity is very nominal, so they didn't bother throwing in there like $100, $500, very nominal amount, so they didn't put that in there. But there is some GP equity. Deferred developer fee. So each affordable housing project is going to have a developer fee, and that developer fee is going to, some's going to be paid from the closing, some will be paid during after construction, but then a good chunk of it may be deferred. We all would love to have a project that have zero deferred, but oftentimes that deferred can help fill a financing gap and be paid through operations. And then you have your soft financing. That's where your gap financing really is. I should have actually labeled this gap financing, because the tax-exempt bonds 9.2, that's going to be, as Andrew discussed, the amount that your rents can be absorbed to pay for your debt service. And so that's where you get sized up. And that 9.2 has to be 50% or more of your total project cost. And that's a requirement. So they have to size it that way with the bonds, that it's 50% or more of your what's called aggregate basis. So you have to meet those compliance. And so if you don't, almost all of 4% projects will have a gap. Right, 9% will have a smaller gap. If maybe some might not have any, but we will have a gap, right, of your financing. That's where you have to really, talk to your local government agencies or nonprofits that are willing to fund that gap to help absorb it. And most of the time, that soft financing doesn't have debt service, right? It's more a balloon payment, very nominal interest rate, not compared to the bonds will have significant, mortgage cost to it. And so if you look here, the flow of funds, right? The investor is going to push down equity to the fund, right? The fund is going to give the equity to the operating partnership. And that kind of trickles out and over time, right? Once you set up an investor, and it's not coming at once. So you're going to have a construction loan as well. That's going to be greater than your mortgage, because when you receive all of your equity, it will pay down your construction loan to convert to perm. So you have maybe 25 or 20% of your equity will come at closing, and they'll help fund construction or pay down some pre-development costs, and then the construction financing will really pay for your construction of the project. And then after construction, you have to meet certain benchmarks. One is place of property and service. One is to start claiming your credits through some compliance called a form called 8609s. So you receive those and you're stabilized, your occupancy, generally that's when all the rest of your equity comes. And that's when you have perm closing. And that money will trickle down through the operating partnership. And what happens is, the developer will receive the developer fee. And each year, for 10 years, the limited partner will receive credits. Andrew mentioned that this partnership is for 15 years, but the compliance period will be 15 years, and oftentimes it's the state of Oregon and the federal rule is for an additional 50 years. So you have 30 years of actually we have to comply with the federal rules of affordable housing. But your credits are claimed for 10 years, and that boosts the yield of your investors. And it's something that it's really fortunate that the federal government said that could be done, because after 10, 11 years, those credits really don't have a lot of juice to them. For 10 years you do, and you have a better return of your investment for your investor and get a higher credit price. And that's really the design of having your credits claimed over 10 years is drive up, investor equity. And it's a really big component, right? That $7 million really helps. And one thing that I would mention is most 4% projects are going to be located in what's called a DDA or QCT, meaning that you get a boost of your costs. Doesn't mean you're paying more. Just when you calculate your credits, you get a 30% boost of your costs, which helps receive more equity and drive down your gap. So right now, where the market is and where construction costs are, I haven't seen too many bond 4% deals that are not in a DDA QCT. Most of them are, just because if not, your gap is too large. You can't find that gap financing that's strong enough to fill the total gap. And the tax-exempt, is one thing to know about tax-exempt bond financing. There's so many different flavors of how it's brought together, and you have a bond counsel, right? Andrew mentioned the service provider. There's going to be a bond counsel, bond attorneys. So sometimes it can be overwhelming to do a 4% deal because there's more financing than just a 9%. Because 9%, well, I'll show you, all you have is a traditional lender and an equity. And you don't have the complexity of issuing bonds, have a bond trustee, a bond issuer, bond holders, and the like. It's very complicated. Fortunately, there's plenty of people out there who work in the bond rules and make it easier to understand and help comply. Because the bond rules also have compliance, right? You have your federal 4% rules, but your bonds have also compliance rules as well you have to follow. Fortunately, a lot of times they mirror the 4% federal rules, and that's helpful so you don't have competing agencies telling you how to comply. Most of the time they're all the same. So that's how the 4% looks financing, right? And the structure, how it works. And it comes together, and it can be complicated, but when it comes together, it's a beautiful thing because what happens at the end, we have affordable housing units. And unfortunately, it is a complicated process, but this is the way that the system we have in terms of generate equity and affordable housing currently in our country. And one thing to know, I always tell people, the local housing tax credit has been around since 1986, right? I was 9 years old when President Reagan signed it into law. And before it was temporary. It wasn't for another 8 years, it's permanent. So right now, this is a permanent fixture of our tax code. And it's one of the most successful public-private partnerships in the country that I know of. Because what happens is the federal government has its rules, and they have agencies, the state agencies, and the investors and the general partners that come together. There's all these checks and balances, right? In the federal government, we have three checks and balances for a federal government. I kind of look at this, right? The investor wants to have really good affordable housing project because that's their name is on there, and so they're making sure this is going to work. The developer wants to receive a developer fee, so they're going to make sure all the financing works. And also, the developer has an intrinsic motive to provide affordable housing, so they want to provide housing that's going to support and be good quality housing. And the federal government comes in and says, well, we're not going to check this. We're passing on to the state. So the state comes in and makes sure and monitors that the affordable housing is done correctly. So I really think it's a beautiful thing. It's complicated, but to me, I'm an accountant. It's a beautiful thing. So that's 4%, right? So this is real quick. Go to 9%. It's like, oh, it's exactly the same. You're absolutely right. But the only thing that really changed, I'll flip back and forth, as you look at there, oftentimes the 9% equity is almost double, right? Depending upon the project, where it is, and the price that you receive. And this is an extreme example. If you're familiar with affordable housing, like that doesn't really happen. It's never zero deferred. Sometimes it does happen. I just wanted to point out here just how the great differences there are between 9% and 4%. You have a lot of deferred developing and a 4%, and definitely gap financing. A 9% deal, you may have still some soft financing. Doesn't always work out. We have none, but it's very small. And oftentimes, because the equity is so high, and your mortgage is a little lower, a lot lower than your 4%, then you might not have a deferred developer fee. But like I said, every deal is really different, and you may have a deferred developer fee, and you may have some soft financing here. But the money flows just the same like in 4%, except you don't have the bond requirements. You don't have the bond issuer, that complexity. Your mortgage could be any lender out there that's willing to provide affordable housing debt on the project. So this is a little less complex because you might not have that many players. You might just have one lender that converts to perm, and then the money still flows just like it did in the 4%. And so obviously we could probably talk for another 4 or 5 hours on this, right? Because these are complex, and that's why you have people like Andrea that are really good about helping out with getting that financing and telling you the players that are out there and how to do the feasibility study. That's really important. And Andrea said, "Hey, is the land or feasibility more important?" Well, I say if you have the land, then probably feasibility is more important, right? Because you can always sell land, doesn't work. If the feasibility doesn't work, then you don't have an affordable housing project. So it's really important to work with people who've done this before and to pencil out your project and run the numbers, do forecasting, talk to people who have that experience to make sure you're heading in the right direction. Because there are some key differences to a regular market rate to do affordable housing. There's a lot of complexities to it, a lot of compliance that if you're not aware of, if you overstep, it could really hinder you going forward. So I would want to say this: make sure you have a good team with you that has done these things before, and if they haven't done it before, make sure they get up to speed of how to do these affordable housing projects and how to finance them. I think that's all I have for my part. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right, we'll take questions for Warren now, and I have a few that I can start with. But here we got a hand in the audience here, and we're going to get you a microphone.
Hi, I'm Betsy. I'm Senator Merkley's field representative covering the Mid-Willamette Valley and the North Coast. And I'm going to ask a question that I should definitely know the answer to, but I'm going to ask you all.
Don't tell your boss.
Thank you, yes. In which situation would a project be pushed towards a 4% versus a 9% tax credit? Like, what are the criteria?
I appreciate that question. I probably should have said that, so thank you. So 9% heavily competitive, right? Especially in Oregon, and most of the time the 9% projects are awarded to developers who are score points and with the state, right? There's an application process, and that state kind of has incentivized a lot of developers to do deeply skewed rents, right? So you have your 30%, 40% of AMI, so maybe 60%. So a lot of times those projects can support that because they have so much equity. And so you see a lot of states, including Oregon, will push for that to say, okay, our 9%, generally what happens is you're going to have some deeply skewed rents, unless there's a developer out there who has a lot of soft financing that could overcome some of the point scoring. But generally, that's where a lot of the 9% projects are falling upon, is on that. And so you say, well, I right now, my project, I can't support a 30% at AMI, a 40% AMI project. So I'm going to do 60% AMI. I'm not going to get 9%. I might as well do 4%. And that's kind of where that's driven. And 4%, as you know, it used to be not competitive in our state. Now it's highly competitive, meaning it's a scarce resource. And I think 40 out of the 50 states in the United States, it's a scarce resource, meaning that there's another application process that's not just first come, first serve. Each states have some rules. I know that, and right now, I think state, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, 4%, it's not competitive for sure, but it's like that because of the scarcity of the resource. There's not a scoring system on the application yet for 4%.
That's correct,
Yeah.
yet, but I don't know if Director Bell is here
It could be coming down the
still.
pipe when it does.
But because of the addition of so many resources, in particular in the Portland metro area, to build affordable housing, the demand for an allocation of 4% in combination with private activity bond allocation has reached a point where the state is needing to look to move to a competitive process, like our neighbors to the north and to the south too, right? California.
Yeah. California and Colorado. Well, Colorado's weird, and Colorado kind of. I mean that it's that there's not really, you have to go through a feasibility study first with the state, and then they say, okay, we like your project, now you can apply. So, but.
And then I think the only thing I would add is that that a 4% project, in order to be attractive to an investor, often it's a larger size project than larger in terms of number of units than a 9% project.
And thank you for saying that. So typically 4% will be larger because the investor, takes some time into underwriting these, and they want to see more credits utilized for their time. And so oftentimes you'll push for a bigger project to be a 4%. Doesn't mean that it can't work for a smaller deal, but a lot of the bigger projects you see, the huge sky rises that you might see in Seattle or Los Angeles, San Francisco, a lot of those are really 200-300 sky rise projects. You see some of that in Oregon, but not as robust and high. But those are considered to be good 4% for investors to invest in. Any other questions? I love the questions from the audience. Can
I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
Wait for the microphone so they can record it there.
Awesome. So you mentioned that there's a scarcity component that creates competitiveness among these tax credits, and I'm curious what the source of that scarcity is. Is it because there are not enough tax credits available at the federal level? Is it because there are investors that are becoming more hesitant in terms of investing in these types of properties? Like, what is the source of that scarcity?
Very good point. So each year, the federal government allocates a certain amount of 9% credits to each state, and it's based on population size. And so that in itself makes a scarcity. And then they also allocate a certain amount of tax on bonds to the states. And it used to be that no state would use up their volume cap. But states can say, well, we have this volume cap, we're going to do 50% for affordable housing and 50% for schools or whatever, a road project. So that's why it could be a scarcity resource. In that is because it's just driven by the federal government and allocating that to the state, and the states therefore administer their programs. So the states can't say, hey, it's a great project, we want to give it to you, but we don't have enough credits to give it to you, so please apply next year. I think on average, correct me if I'm wrong, like between 9 and 11 projects and 9% are awarded in Oregon on average, about that. Yeah, and 4% it varies depending upon which projects are there, but that's kind of just give you that. I think our state, only 9 or 11 per year, or 9%, right? So that's not a lot, and you know that there's a problem throughout all the Western United States for affordable housing.
Yeah. And I think in terms of like advocacy as an industry, but correct me if I'm wrong, but this 50% test, which you referenced, which is complicated in and of itself, but that is federal rule, right? The
Yes,
50%
yes.
test. And if there has been advocacy around looking at reducing the 50% test down to
25 or 30.
yeah, which would reduce the demand for those private activity bonds so that the market wouldn't be quite so tight, and then we could distribute those we call them PABs, across more projects.
Yeah.
So that's like a legislative fix that is being looked at to help address this problem nationwide.
Did you have something to say? You were raising your hand.
Okay.
Yeah, yes. And I'm sure Senator Merkley is aware of that. What's our other senator's name? Sorry. The representative will be very mad at me. What's the other Oregon Senator? Merkley and Wyden, sorry. I know Wyden is very, I have brain freeze, is very heavily involved in affordable housing, like Senator Merkley is. And but the one thing I point out with that is, if say it gets reduced by 25%, you still have an increased finance gap.
Yep.
And so it would allow for more projects, but are the projects going to be feasible? Can they receive more, obviously probably third-party debt as well. So you might have bonds, third-party debt, soft financing, equity. So you might layer in more financial source to make it a little more complex. But so just because you get it lowers, it doesn't necessarily mean that all those projects will be feasible. They find a way to make them feasible. Yeah.
Let's get another microphone over there.
At the city level, what partnerships or how do you originally bring those relationships together to try to bring something like this to the local level?
That's probably a better question. Yeah.
So in many jurisdictions, not in the rural communities here in Oregon, but in many jurisdictions, there'll be funding that is available that's often through the federal government, like home or CDBG funds, and those are put through some sort of competitive funding application process. I think one of the dynamics, though, is that the smaller the jurisdiction, the smaller the allocation of home and CDBG funds, and these projects need a much larger infusion of subsidy than the allocation given to these smaller jurisdictions. There's almost an inversion where, I live here in the city of Portland. I'm not shaming the city of Portland, but they get a really large allocation of funds, multiple types of funds. And so it's almost as if the home in CDBG should be increased in size for the smaller jurisdictions versus giving those large jurisdictions the largest amount, because those large jurisdictions, Portland and the whole metro area under metro government has an affordable housing bond now that is an incredible resource, and so it feels like we could do a better look at how the resources are allocated across the state, so that we can make sure that we're not just building affordable housing in the urban areas, but we're truly addressing needs in rural areas. Thanks.
We have time for a few more questions on this topic before we get to Elaine's presentation on how urban renewal can be a specific source of funding to fill the gap at the local level. Any other detailed, nitty-gritty questions when it comes to LIHTC here? Warren, I had one question which is similar to one I asked Andrea earlier, which is, let's say you are a experienced market rate developer looking to do an affordable project for the first time. You've heard that LIHTC is out there and it's a source of potential funding for your project. Who do you turn to first in order to start exploring the feasibility of this financing tool?
I think first you probably want to look at, after you have a general understanding of the industry, probably finding a site, right, that's been zoned for it. And then, you can turn to a group like Andrea for feasibility. She does it. We do feasibility studies a lot for our clients. So anyone who has kind of a finance background, run through the numbers, because it's really important for someone who's not in affordable housing and in rental real estate, that has an affordable housing, to have someone who goes through and pencils the numbers and combs it through pretty good, so there's not mistakes made and they cannot fully understand where all the sources are from, the compliance issues, the financing gaps you may have, and the compliance issues you'll have to face. So somebody who has a finance background, whether that's a development consultant, finance consultant, a CPA, that can help you run through the feasibility numbers.
Perfect.
Yeah, and something I did not mention earlier when you asked me that same question is the understanding the policy overlays. So Warren mentioned these DDAs and QCTs, really understanding if a piece of land that you're contemplating purchasing, if it's in or out of one of those designated areas, could make or break a project. And so the policy overlay is how will this piece of land score against the policy targets at OHCS, at the Oregon Housing and Community Services. So that's just another thing to be looking at in addition to the financial piece. But you want to make sure if you can pencil it out and it's financially feasible, if it doesn't compete well for the financing resources, that's not good either.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn things over to our last panelist, Elaine Howard. Elaine is with Elaine Howard Consulting and is the foremost expert in urban renewal and tax increment financing in the state of Oregon. So Elaine, I'll turn it to you.
Good morning. I think what those of you who clapped about non-Portland area will really appreciate this, because you can see these are all rural places throughout Oregon who have figured out how to use a different tool to help them with their housing crises. And urban renewal and tax increment financing is really complicated. We can spend a whole day going through what that is, and that's not what we're doing today, but what I am doing today is just telling you about some different localities who have figured out how to make this tool work for them. in an innovative and different way. And just to give Nick a little bit of kudos here, although I do a lot of this work, Nick partners with me with his firm on all things urban renewal, so he's kind of the financial genius behind a lot of what these programs are doing in the different communities. So the communities that I'm going to cover are John Day, Hermiston, Madras, and Burns, and just talk a little bit about what they've done recently for affordable housing. So John Day contacted us about 4 years ago and said they have a housing crisis in John Day. And the local hospital cannot hire new employees because there's no place for them to live within the community. And at the point that Nick Green, the then city manager, contacted us, in the prior 10 years, only 5 new homes had been built in the city of John Day. And the reason for that was the cost of housing versus the ability to pay for buying a new house or paying the rent to make that house affordable. Nick had done quite a bit of work with the county assessor before he even contacted us to try to figure out what would work in terms of urban renewal and trying to figure out what that funding gap is and how urban renewal could fund it. If any of you have ever known urban renewal areas or know anything about it, in Oregon there's this understanding that urban renewal areas need to be contiguous. And if you're trying to do a housing urban renewal area, that causes some issues because, there we go, not because of me, because of the location of housing throughout the city. And so what we did with John Day is sat down and identified every vacant parcel that was residentially zoned and houses that were in need of rehabilitation and figured out a way to tie them together. So you can see that the green on this map is right-of-way. So we tied, to meet statutory restrictions, we tied these parcels together to form one contiguous urban renewal area for the city of John Day. What urban renewal does is provide a funding source to the city to allow any growth within that area, the taxes off of that growth, to be reallocated instead of going to the different taxing districts to the urban renewal agency to fund programs and projects within that urban renewal area. John Day created an economic development fund through their utility charges to front load this urban renewal area because clearly urban renewal funds off of increase in growth, but if there's no new development, you don't have that increase in growth. So they created a fund to provide the upfront money to use to incentivize new development within the city. Their goal over 20 years was to build 100 new homes and to renovate an additional 100 homes. In Oregon, most urban renewal districts levy 100% of their allowed revenues every year, which means that they tell the assessor for all the properties within that urban renewal area, they want to take the full amount of that increased taxes off of the growth within those properties. When John Day started their program, they started it saying, we aren't going to take the full amount of growth off of these properties. We only want to fund urban renewal on those properties that are actually using the tool and providing new housing. So we will only take that division of taxes from those properties that are using the urban renewal tool, and the rest of that tax money will go back to all those different taxing districts instead of the city getting it itself. They decide to provide a rebate to builders or developers of any new housing as a percentage of the net increase in assessed value of the home. So they worked with the assessor up front to figure out what those assessed values of those homes would be on a new construction and figured out what that percentage rebate needed to be to fill that gap to incentivize builders to actually develop that housing. They estimated that that rebate needed to be 7% of that total assessed value, which was really only an amount of $12,460, plus the ability to rebate for systems development charges, so an additional $7,400. They figured if they could have that approximately $20,000 incentive, that would provide the reason for builders to go ahead and either build speculative housing or to build on contract where we know somebody's going to need a new home, but we know they'll be able to afford to go into that house. They started that program that way, and then they found out, and I think it was partially through our work in Madras, which we'll talk about in a minute, that they also needed to fund infrastructure because they had included large parcels within their urban renewal area that were residentially zoned but didn't have the streets, water, sewer, infrastructure. So they changed their program to actually allow their urban renewal plan to also invest in infrastructure for these new development projects. That, however, also meant that that underlevy that we talked about a couple of minutes ago went away because they really did need that 3% increase in assessed values on existing properties to help fund that infrastructure for the provision of new development on those lots. So what has their success been? They have, and you know, if you're from Portland, this doesn't make a difference. If you're from John Day and you only had 5 homes built in the last 10 years, this is phenomenal success for them. So they had 17 homes built or are in construction as of an audit that was done earlier this year. They have one subdivision complete and platted of 4 lots, another subdivision of 11 lots that is in construction and platted, a new subdivision in construction of 17 lots, and then another 2 subdivisions in planning. So the tool has been incredibly successful for this community and caused development that clearly was not happening or not going to happen within the community. The next city we'll cover is Madras. Madras came a couple of years after John Day. Nick and I had worked with Madras on, they have a business urban renewal district throughout their downtown. They contacted us, they had completed a housing needs assessment, and the housing needs assessment said all these things that all of you in your communities know is true to your community also, which is theirs was 32% of their households were paying more, were cost burdened. No new multifamily units had been developed in Madras since 2010. Only 49 new single-family units were developed. 105 people were experiencing homelessness, and there was a deficit of 401 housing units to meet the needs of households earning less than $25,000 per year, and a deficit of 435 housing units to meet the needs of households earning between $50,000 and $100,000 per year. So this again is an odd-looking urban renewal area if you're used to seeing one contiguous area. In the middle of this area is their business district, and no urban renewal area can contain property in 2 different areas. So to figure out how to skirt that central area, we had to go up and around. We couldn't go through it, but we again included all residential property that needed to be developed. Several of these properties had been platted prior to the recession, but not developed because there was no funding. And once the recession really was over, there was really no ability to jumpstart the development on these properties. So again, we went all over the city and pulled in those properties that should be ripe for development. Their types of incentives were either a direct contribution of funds upfront to a developer, a rebate of a portion of property taxes paid over time, contributions to the developer for infrastructure development, or an agreement of the developer for the agency to complete infrastructure improvements that are otherwise required as a condition of development approval. So sometimes you're required to develop a portion of a road, but you don't really have the funds to develop that, so they can put that money in a fund for the urban renewal agency to, once they have the sufficient amount of money from probably the other side of the street and that development, then the city is able to put that infrastructure in, or a combination of all of those. On the direct contribution of funds up front, that was a lower amount of money than the amount of money that is a rebate of a portion of property taxes paid, because the urban renewal agency would have to get those monies up front through borrowing from a loan that would be repaid. And so we made that incentive a lower value incentive, hoping to get developers to pick that larger incentive that was reliant on those property taxes being paid and the ability then to rebate those property taxes. Their goals were to develop 964 new housing units in 30 years at all income levels. So we all know we're talking here about affordable housing in the smaller communities. It's very clear that developing any housing helps with their overall housing crisis, because if you're able to put in a higher level unit, somebody will move into that. Somebody else will then be able to use that unit that they moved out from. So when we work in the smaller communities, a lot of times their focus isn't strictly on affordable, it's on any housing, because they know that that will help deal with their overall needs. Their goals were also to provide that infrastructure to support housing development and to develop parks to support that housing development. So having the money to make sure that there was that great environment for housing development. Nick worked with the folks at the City of Madras to develop spreadsheets for both single-family housing and multifamily housing to try to figure out rebate amounts. And this is all really complicated, and I won't go through all of it, but the end result is just looking at, we have to look at the real market value, what the change property ratio is, because taxes aren't paid off of real market value, they're paid off of assessed value, and then what that tax rate might be and what the amount of revenue would be to the urban renewal agency to figure out how much of a rebate you could promise to a developer. In this case, over 7 years, that rebate was about $16,640. That's through the urban renewal. Madras also was doing system development charge reimbursement to help make the housing affordable. This is the real market value of a little different price house. So it's a $245,000 house, and the 7 years of total TIF would be $16,640. So if we go backwards, that was oh, and just looking at what those lump sum options were. So if you did the 50% of the incentive, which is you got it up front, instead of getting that $16,640, you received $8,320. If you did that tax rebate over a 7-year time period, you could get rebated the total $16,000. And then if you did that towards infrastructure, the city would put that amount of money, that $16,640, into an infrastructure fund to pay for those offsite improvements that you have as a requirement of your development. This is a multifamily example. So this is a larger development where the real market value is $3 million. So the 7 years of total rebates or incentive is $346,175. This is their area and the different developments that they're working on. So you can see that there are around the city and you can't see it very clearly, I'm sorry, but you can see that there are a number of developments that are moving ahead because of their ability to help provide that gap of financing through the use of urban renewal. So the year after we did Madras, we worked with the city of Burns. We developed a program that was very similar to the one in Madras, except it didn't have an existing urban renewal area like Madras did in their central area. So the urban renewal area we developed for Burns included both housing and the ability to help assist in downtown improvements. So storefront improvements, or even doing housing in the downtown, or streetscape improvements in the downtown. So they married those two types of urban renewal programs, the housing and the downtown improvements, together within one urban renewal plan and one district. And then last summer, we worked in Hermiston. There was a large piece of property on the south end of Hermiston, and a developer, Monte Vista Homes, had come to them and wanted to develop housing there. It had no services whatsoever. But Hermiston, similar to all of our other rural cities, has a huge housing deficit, and they decided that urban renewal would be an effective tool to help make this development happen. And so Nick and I worked with them on the overall concept, what the city is using those urban renewal funds, and those funds will come from the development that happens within that area. The city will use those to put in the infrastructure and also to develop parks within the area. The developer is donating a large parcel of land to the school district to build a new school, another large parcel of land to the fire district to put in a new fire station, and then putting in nearly 1,000, over the years, 1,000 housing units. So this unit is covering all different income types and affordability levels. The smaller units they had about 300 of those. The standard units, so what would be a normal housing unit in the city of Hermiston, 525, 275 of what would be maybe a higher square footage unit, and then 150 multifamily units and 80 senior housing units. So a really nice community. The site plan, which I didn't put in here, is developed very nicely with a lot of trails within the community. Those trails will be paid for through the urban renewal funds. So the actual housing on this itself, the unit, is not being subsidized, but the infrastructure to allow this housing to occur is what is being subsidized. I think at lunchtime you're going to hear about the Jory Apartments and a program that the city of Salem is doing, and Nick and I worked on that with them. And that program started out as a concept of a developer, or the city knowing that a developer is going to develop a multifamily apartment unit, and connecting with that developer and saying, would you, as part of the development of this multifamily apartment unit, like to develop some affordable housing? And in exchange for you developing that affordable housing, we will provide you with a property tax rebate to provide that incentive that a portion of your units, and that's negotiated based on the financial feasibility, a portion of those units become affordable and long-term affordable. So it's a program for Salem, and it's a single property urban renewal area. So it's similar to the Hermiston one, only it contained single family and multifamily. In this one, it is one big apartment complex that becomes its own urban renewal area, funded through the property taxes that are paid as a result of that new development, and encouraging what would otherwise be a totally market rate development to become partially subsidized. And that's the end of that presentation. and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. That's obviously a very innovative use of urban development funding. I seem to have missed, though, how it is that this initial investment on the part of the city and the county is going to be ultimately returned to the community so that this investment equalizes out over time.
I think that's a great question, and I think the answer is not necessarily just a monetary answer. It's an answer in terms of providing more housing for the community, providing affordable housing to the community, providing housing so that when people apply for a job in the community, they actually feel like they can live there. At some point when the urban renewal area ends, that goes back on the tax rolls, and all of the different taxing districts enjoy that increased assessed value. But urban renewal is typically a 25 to 30-year program, so it takes a while for that monetary investment to get returned. But in terms of the housing urban renewal areas, the investment that's really returned to the community is the ability to provide housing choices and good housing choices to the community.
Oh, well, hang 1 second for the microphone to make its way back to you.
So as I understand it, what you're implying is that the initial investment, the tax of the property in question, then gets developed in such a way that at a later date, the taxes that then apply to it are significantly higher. And that's the mechanism that this initial investment returns to the city's funding, the general funding. Am I correct in that?
Yes, and you covered that very well. Thank you. Yes, exactly. So if you have a piece of bare land, like they did in John Day, and then with no development on it, it becomes a subdivision of 17 houses, and you have all that assessed value that then returns to the property tax rolls when urban renewal is gone. The taxes off of that will go to all of those different taxing jurisdictions to help provide services. So, good question.
We have just another couple of minutes if there are any other questions from the audience. We don't want to keep you from your lunch. We don't want to keep me from my lunch either. I see a question in the back there.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kirsten Ray from the Oregon HUD office. Good to be here. And while we're on the topic of financing, just want to share a quick announcement on a NOFO that just came out called the HUD Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. So this fund's made available through the Inflation Reduction Act, and it provides owners of multifamily housing with capital to invest in technologies like solar panels, heat pumps, insulation, things like that. So if you have any questions about this program or any other HUD questions, I'll be here. Thanks.
Nick?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one other thing. In Oregon, both cities and counties have the authority to establish urban renewal areas. So sometimes in a rural county, if your cities don't have the ability to establish an area on their own, a county could actually establish an urban renewal area, and there are only a couple of those established by counties in Oregon, but they do have the legal authority to do that. And a city could establish that kind of in partnership with a nonprofit, knowing that a nonprofit would come in and help to facilitate development. So if you're out there saying, well, we don't have the ability to establish an urban renewal area, go work with your city and say, we've heard about this as a potential tool. Help us figure out how we can make that work in our community.
Okay. All right, thank you, Elaine. Let's get one more round of applause for all of our panelists. And thank you all for all the great questions during the presentation. I really do appreciate having that conversation with you all rather than just us talking to you.